Today I'll be talking about how faith and power interplay in early Renaissance Florence and how that shows up in the Divine Comedy. So the 13th century Florence it's not really the Renaissance at this point, but we get the ideas of the Renaissance are there, and Florence is sort of considered the city of the birth of the Renaissance, and that's because of how prosperous it was. So at the time in the 13th century, Italy is made up of loads of independent city-states, and Florence at the time is one of the most prosperous ones. This is because of their really successful wool trade and their really strong currency, which becomes trusted in Europe and across the world. And this is why they become a banking centre in the Renaissance. And at the time, Florence has a population that's comparable to London at 80,000. So Florence is what they consider a republic, where there's a constitution that limits the powers of the nobility, because the Duke of Milan, the King of Naples, weren't actually able to conquer Florence. And people who live there are really proud of the fact that they live in this democratic government, even if only a few people can actually vote. They're really proud of this, because they saw themselves as the ideal city-state where the freedom of the individual is guaranteed and you have a right to participate in government. But as well as the government, also have the power of the church, because even though the Renaissance is sort of associated with moving away from the church and we're looking towards this ideas of humanism and intellectual culture, Florence is still deeply religious at the time. You couldn't really separate religion and politics at all. You know, Florence called itself the New Jerusalem and the city chosen by God, and this is because the church dominated all aspects of daily life. So church leaders would advise city rulers to promote loyalty to the government and the church, encourage religious beliefs. They had a threat of excommunication. They could use other people, and they held power over literacy and could deem works heretical if they wanted to. And the church also held a lot of wealth by being a major landowner and earning wealth in their property and collecting taxes. So you might be thinking, wow, Florence doesn't sound too bad to live in, especially if you're really religious. But as Florence is deeply divided at the time, both internally and externally. So one way it's divided internally is so the way the government is set up is there's a council of 9 who are elected, and how they do this is they put the names of the members of town guild, and they literally pick them out of a bag. They pick their names out of a bag, and they only serve for 2 months at a time. So what's good is that prevents dictatorship from anyone, but it also means there's a lack of continuity in who's ruling, and it also meant that powerful families could manipulate these elections for their own interests. And the other internal divide is, call it a divide, but there is a really big problem of corruption in the church. So you have loads of members of the clergy selling church positions and privileges for money. You have a lot of them using their position for personal enrichment, and many of them are committing the sin of avarice, where rather than living a life of poverty, they choose to live a life of luxury. But how Florence is divided externally is a lot more serious. So the city-states, although they're independent, they're all at war with each other all the time, because they're fighting over economic rivalry or territory, and they want to gain dominance in the region. But the biggest power struggle at the time is between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. So both of them claimed leadership over Christendom for different reasons. So the Holy Roman Emperor claimed leadership by saying he was a descendant of Charlemagne, who was crowned emperor in 800 AD, and he saw himself as the successor of the ancient Roman emperor. And his supporters called themselves the Ghibellines, and they challenged the power of the Pope. But then the Pope claims leadership over Christendom by obviously acting as God's representative on earth, claiming spiritual leadership and as the inheritor of one of the apostles. And their supporters were called the Guelphs, and they wanted to resist the power of Germany and the Holy Roman Empire in Italy. And this is what led to all this division in Renaissance Florence. So all these powerful families were now rivals with each other, supporting either the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor. And there was one event where this young guy named Dante, he was going to marry into a rival family, got murdered by that family, and then that was like the trigger for the rest of all this violence that was going to happen. And there was really high rates of just murder and then subsequent revenge and subsequent murder, and it was not good. So the council in Florence, they were like, we need to fix this, and we're going to appoint someone to maintain public order, and it's got to be someone who's a foreigner, someone who's not from here, so then they don't have any bias. But then the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, appoints his own son, which I think that means he's kind of biased. So he obviously ends up supporting the Holy Roman Emperor, and means the Guelphs who support the Pope flee, and then the Holy Roman Emperor dies, so then the Guelphs come back, and there's just this constant back and forth between the two. But then they attack their cities, and they come back, attack them, and they keep fleeing, coming back. But then in 1266, the Florentine Guelphs joined forces with other cities, and it's this alliance that led to a really big decline in the Holy Roman Empire in Italy. And it's at this point that the Guelphs have some power in Italy again, and this is like the world that our protagonist, if you will, is born into. This guy. So this is Dante. He's if you don't know him, you probably do, but he's a poet and a politician, and he is born in Florence in 1265, and he is an incredibly devout Catholic, and this is shown by the fact that his families are supporters of the Pope, they are supporters of the Guelphs, and despite the fact that the Guelphs are in power in Florence again, there is still this really strong rivalry, and Dante himself takes part in a lot of these battles. And in the year 1300, he is elected to the council, but even within his short term of 2 months, he is sick of all the corruption you see, of the violence in the city, and this so-called democracy that runs deep in this city that's already divided. And it's at this point that the politics gets even worse. So you get the ruling Guelphs who are already in, they split even further. So you get the white Guelphs who are opposed to the Pope interfering in Florentine politics. So they're not necessarily against the authority of the Pope, they're against him interfering in their politics. And you get the black Guelphs who want a closer alliance with the Pope. So Dante supports the white Guelphs, and they end up expelling the black Guelphs. But then Dante finds out that the Pope at the time, Pope Boniface VIII, he is backing a black Guelph invasion of Florence. So he gets sent as the head of a diplomatic mission to intervene with the Pope in Rome. He ends up but the black Guelphs end up succeeding in Florence, and Dante gets arrested and convicted of corruption in Rome, and he is sentenced to exile in 1302. He is given chances to come back. There's fines, there's pardons, but he doesn't take any of them because he believes that he's right in this. And the government says that if he returns, after he is sent to permanent exile, and if he returns, him and his sons will be burned at the stake. So it's only after this that he starts writing his most famous work, Divine Comedy. So at this point, he starts writing it in 1308, which is 6 years after he is exiled. So the Divine Comedy is, if you don't know it, it's a narrative poem, and it follows Dante through his journey of being in Inferno, so hell, purgatory and paradise, as he's led by the ancient Roman poet Virgil. And it's generally looking at the journey of the soul and looking at sins for what they truly are. But what I want to look at is how Dante uses the religious ideas of hell and purgatory to make moral judgments about political figures, because most of the criticisms of politicians come up in the Inferno, and he uses Florence as this microcosm for the rest of the world. So there's sort of two journeys. It's described as Dante has two journeys. So as he's going further down into hell, he's reaching the ninth circle, which is the worst sin. He's not only reaching the evil that corrupted Adam and Eve, but he's also reaching the origins of political evil in Florence. So just as Adam and Eve lived in grace before the original sin, Dante believes that Florence lived in grace before this factional violence. So his exile is the central fact in the whole comedy, and the rivalry between both the Guelphs and the Ghibellines and the white and black Guelphs is represented in the poem. He sees this factional violence as the root of chaos, and it's destroyed Florence through corruption and greed. It was destroyed by a city that's in moral decay. But he doesn't see Florence he sees it as corrupt, but he doesn't see it as hopeless. And you can see that throughout the poem, that there are figures that talk to him as he goes through his journey that tell him that Florence will get better. But so many of the members of the opposite political faction end up in the Inferno, suffering in the many ways you can suffer, being burnt alive, drowning in boiling blood, things like that. As well as corrupt politicians, members of the clergy, and Florentine leaders. So a lot of the people who have come up, well spoken about already, get put in part of the Inferno. So the Pope at the time is put in the third ditch of the sixth circle because he was guilty of selling church positions for money. So his punishment is that he is put head first into a hole full of fire, and his feet are facing out, and then and it's supposed to be a metaphor for the corruption of the church. So if he's head first in the fire, another pope will come along. When he dies, that pope will get pushed down, another one gets thrown in the hole full of fire, which is a metaphor for the continuous corruption of the church. And there are people who Dante knew who are in the ninth circle of hell, because there are basically within each circle of hell there are like different parts of it. So in treachery you get traitor to your homeland, traitor to your guests, traitor to your family, and there's someone who his name is Abati, and he is seen as a traitor to Italy. That's why he's placed in the ninth circle of hell. And you can, as you read it, you can just see all the names and all the people that he interacted who are condemned for gluttony, wrath, heresy, and they're all people who Dante had an interaction with through this political violence. But one thing to note is that the Divine Comedy, even though it is it is a criticism of the politics of Florence, is also deeply personal. So a lot of the people who Dante sort of grew up with, his tutor is there, and even though Dante admires him, his tutor is condemned for the sin of sodomy, and he is placed in the second circle of hell, to show that Dante above all believes in the immutable laws of God above everything else, even if he admires someone. Then you get to purgatory, which is like the second section of the book, and this is where people who are victims of the corruption by leaders in Florence are placed. And whilst he has sympathy for them, he still believes they should suffer, to cleanse their souls. And then you get paradise, which is where everyone wants to go in this, and then it's what all the virtues of old Florence are, because Dante believes that the time when Italy was its best was the Roman Empire, basically. Because in hell, long story short, Lucifer's got 3 heads, and 2 of those heads are Cassius and Brutus, who obviously killed Caesar. And he thinks that's one of the worst things that happened. So Dante just wants this, has this nostalgic idea of Italy and Florence again. Okay, so Dante uses the Divine Comedy to criticize the corruption of the church, since he believed it was too intertwined with politics and too worldly. He thinks the truest form of the church is in Christ and not in material possessions or wealth or political rule. The Pope believed that he's given authority from God and he should impart political authority, but Dante believed that it was God gave the Pope and the Emperor authority, and they should impart that and not hold political power themselves, and all their power came from God. But overall, the Divine Comedy was really important, not only for understanding this factional violence within Florence, but as well as establishing the Italian language. So Dante is considered the father of the Italian language, since his use of Tuscan was widely used. And the Divine Comedy was really important when sort of actual Renaissance happens. It shaped Renaissance Florentine identity and political thought, and shaped ideas about responsibility and political greed. So, thank you for listening.